No, it's a very long title. I should have made it a little briefer. Yeah, so Randy actually won't be, she couldn't get back into town in time to do the presentation with me, but I will speak to a bit of a project that Randy and I have done together. Randy Johnner and Kathleen Irwin and myself are on a grant, or several grants actually, which just makes me nervous even to talk about it, because I just didn't realize how hard it is to manage grants. It's a lot of work. So on performance and difference and developing languages around, user-friendly languages around working with all abilities in the performing arts, and hopefully coming out with some recommendations and resources for teachers in the field. My students have been very nervous about working in classrooms with difference, and so I'm trying to kind of take that nervousness out and refill it with some skills, capacities, and language that they can use. And I'm very grateful that my friend Natasha is here to help me a little. Natasha and I have been working together in this project, neither heroes nor ordinary people, which was a revised theater piece with mixed abilities that went up on the Riddell Center in the Sandbox last fall. And we've both been working together on Blood as well. Is that it, or were there other things? Yeah, yes, and Kathryn Brack's Remeasure. Yeah. So, excellent. And we're going to keep going. So this is wonderful. So what I'm going to do is, because you already know background, I'm going to zip through part of the sort of the ancestry of my practice and move into some storytelling around, just let me get up my other slideshow, some storytelling around the work that I've been doing with mixed abilities and performance. Okay, we'll get you out of there. Yeah, sure. And we take this one in. And just make sure that this works. Good. Okay. So there's that long title. And I'm just going to get closer to you because I don't want to be way up there. Everyone always takes the back rows, right? You're all bad. So I'll zip through the background. I'll talk a little bit about my theory and method, but not a lot. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the power of stories and how I work with stories, and then some case examples. And then Natasha and I are going to show a little bit of some examples of ways in which I'm discovering new methods. So this is kind of the list of some of the projects and stories that I'll go through. So this you might have seen before, but I'll just go through them fairly quickly, and you're going to see a change in my work from something that was kind of virtuosic and aesthetic until something that becomes a little bit more narrative-oriented, and with moving away from trained dancers. So this is an important slide because I worked with Jorge Holguin for many years. He died of AIDS in 1989. And in his last few years, I worked as his kind of both creative muse, but also physical conduit, as he lost his ability to move. So he would feed me with metaphors, images, and stories, and I would move them. And then dancers would in turn interpret them. So this is important because this is how I began to learn how to work with other narratives within my own performing tool, if you will. So risk has been a big part of the work that I do, working in spaces other than theater spaces, warehouses, moving buses, back alleys, courtyards. And of course with that does come with risk and live conditions. So live conditions are really also important for me because I feel like they trigger a certain kind of presence and authenticity. So for example, again, you can see stories and working with actors and dancers. this is a situation where these boys were doing a very slow adagio with teacups on their head, and if they in fact dropped the teacup, they would smash on the ground because they weren't plastic and they weren't joined cup and saucer. And so the kind of focus and concentration that you can see in their face right now is real. And I believe that audiences can also perceive that reality of perceived risk embedded in the creative process. So that to me brings a certain kind of presence and awareness and deep listening that I think are some of the tenets of working with mixed abilities and performance. So then I start to slowly work out of trained dancers and into community folk and people who might have stories of isolation, loneliness, displacement. So I'm working with marginalized groups, elders, youth at risk, newcomers, and mixed abilities. So that forced me to go back to do my grad work because I didn't know enough around that. And this is what I have come up with, is something called Embodied Poetic Narrative, which I think I've talked to all of you before about, in terms of using artifacts, stories, and the body in an equal kind of trilogy to find a certain kind of profound meaning that can be interpreted and reinterpreted by audiences. So I'm not running a storyline that you either get or you don't get. So I'll just read this story because it's really important, and I think maybe you've heard it before, Valerie. I'm sorry if you have. But it is an important part of, I've talked about presence and immediacy, and now I'm going to talk about working off axis. So if I'm working on my spine, then I'm working in a certain kind of verticality and controlling my knowledge and my perceived and my conveyed knowledge. If I start to work off my spine in an asymmetrical or off-axis way, I begin to disrupt that sense of knowing and those habituated ways of knowing, and I open new ways of knowing. And I think this is why it's amazing to work in education and to work with embodied ways of knowing opposed to this notion of 5, 6, 7, 8 dance. So I love working with like my T&M1 class, for example, where they come from all different backgrounds. They don't hope to be able to dance when they come out of it. They only want to be unafraid of their bodies and a dynamic learning space. And so that's what I feel like I'm really privileged to be teaching in. So here's where I started to think about that. I work with a counselor, theater director, who's also interested in exploring unconventional ways of developing script. He's brought a hockey stick as an emblem of self within a particular period in his life. He begins his remembered stories holding the stick with ease, an extension of his body. He sweeps around with imaginary slap shots on goal, and with power and control he speaks of his father. He tells me what he knows, but I'm not interested in the telling of what is known, but rather exploring the space where discovery lies. I ask him to work with the stick using any part of his body but his hands. He starts to balance the stick on his shoulder, under his knee. The signifiers become fractured. He begins to work with the properties of the stick, the texture, the weight, pliability, and dimensions. The stick brings another movement to his body and tone to his voice. I begin to hear another side of the same story. What was once power and control gets mixed up in the navigation of this object through time and space. The activity is transformed to a gentle inquiry and results in tender curiosity. With this comes a concert of emotions playing back and forth and inviting the participant into a place of unknowing. This is the place where discovery lies. So I would also say that for me, the most important thing in theater and in dance is intentionality. So if I start to work in that way where unexpected information comes into play, my intention becomes very immediate and very present. And so I have no choice but to be very clear about where I am in that moment. So in dance, often we're not talking. And so we have to be really clear. If I am standing over my deceased lover and I have the poison bottle in my hand, but I'm not speaking, then I have to be really clear about my intention of the story, the object, and my intention for the audience to understand what just happened. So for me, I'm giving you lots of sort of key cornerstones: presence, immediacy, authenticity, intentionality, and defragmenting our habituated ways of understanding. So this is the character that I have been using, which I've done a Sidru talk on before, which is what I consider to be a kinesthetic conduit to other people's stories. Long overcoat, felt hat, old suitcases, and I listen deeply. I'll listen deeply to the stories of others and then somehow channel the fragments through my body into space. Often working with other musicians, writers, other actors, dancers. This one was called A Suitcase Full of Countries, and it was performed in the 2010 Olympics. And people wrote on a blog what they saw. So within those improvisations, I trigger stories in other people, and they trigger stories in other people, and we start this domino effect of stories triggering stories. And that is how I would begin my work in devised theater, devised dance, with all abilities, is that we would begin by creating a community of practice that would be based on stories. And this is what I consider to be what I'm doing all the time when I'm working in performance, is I'm working within a framework that has an unknowingness within that. I'm going to just go through that. That one's not important. So I'm going to start to talk now. I've just done a little bit of my background and my theory. I'm going to talk now about some of the examples of things that I have done. So this is working with a group of elders and a sound media technician from Saskatoon who embeds stories within computer chips that are then in turn embedded in different set pieces. So right here are some of those computer chips of stories that the elders have told us around their lives. And they're playing some rudimentary instruments that will trigger those stories to come into space. So then what we've done is we've embedded them in these planks that we start to move on. And so as we are moving some of the images and metaphors of the stories, they are also being triggered as they move over the planks. So if I would start with let's warm up and let's then tell a story about the first time or the last time then we would begin to poeticize those stories in certain ways, record them, and then start to embed them into different ways that they could be used and accessed in a performance situation. So I would say that, Natasha, it's very similar to how you worked with the Heroes piece in terms of stories were being told, people were bringing in material, they were listening to each other, that reminded them of something else, and then the piece started to unfold. Does that sound similar to how you were working?
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. And I would also say that in that sense, the cast feels empowered in that process, opposed to me coming in as a director or choreographer saying, okay, let's see what you can do. Let's move around with this story, and it's my story. It started from baseline and from the participants. So what would happen is that what Husserl would call an intersubjective space, where we start with our own story. Let's see if I can get that. There we go. We start with our own story, and then we start to move that through sharing it through our lived experiences with other people in the room, which then starts to find those connections with each other, those common understandings, and then maybe some new understandings. So I've done some creative work with youth at risk, where we look at identity and isolation. These are CD cases where they find an image that best represents their life and then create a playlist on that of identifiable pieces in their lives that would represent some of the milestones. Moving that into collected stories that become visual backdrops, theater pieces and movement pieces. This is a piece where I think the next slide will give you in writing what this is, but if you can see, it's rather subtle, but the person has been photoshopped. So she suddenly has a waistline, she has thinner legs, and then she starts to write a story over top. I'll just give you a second to read that. Newcomers, isolation, having high school students interview all of the people in their family that they can to figure out ancestral movement, and then giving them a map of their school, a map of their neighborhood, and a map of the world, and having them track their movement on a daily basis, their movement as a family, and their movement as an extended family on a global level, putting those on transparencies and layering them to create pathways, and then creating movement on those pathways. So that's a way of integrating a concept into a movement piece that's a little more poeticized. So what comes out of that is that when they share the stories of their interviews with their grandfathers or grandmothers or great-grandmothers, they begin to find out that there's some common threads of stories and that they started to link in their classroom with each other, but they also started to feel that they linked to their family and their heritage because they had never really talked to their grandfather before about the movement in his life. So that by the time we get to colored lines and pathways, it has a lot of meaning to them because it's fueled by a lot of stories that are shared in the space. So I would never ever start a dance piece by having participants come into a dance studio and start to move immediately. I might warm people up and then go into writing and conversation, but I would never start a choreography or a structured improvisation not based on personal narratives. So invisibility, I'm just going to go through these really quick because they're kind of fun, but I might use this in a classroom to trigger conversations around cultural displacement. So I have a whole talk that I do around cultural erasure, and we won't go into that in depth right now, but This is an artist who works with a notion of invisibility, and you'll start to see the artist embedded in these images as we go. Does everybody see the... So I might have these, as I had the slideshow on a loop when you were coming in, often I will do a kind of artful provocation to start my class, where I will have a loop of images and it will ready the students to talk about a subject, and this subject is invisibility. And that might start to have conversations around notions of cultural displacement, identity crisis, isolations, assimilation issues. But we would do it from an artful provocation, opposed to today we're going to talk about. And you know, it could also be that I just find one slide that's really very powerful. So there's a website called Colossal, and you can actually it's a photo essay website, and you can just key in a word like isolation, and you will find photo essays that are based on that. So I might even, on my UR courses, make a theme throughout my weeks of classes that are based on one of those photo essays. This is Banksy, and it's not a very high quality resolution, but this is certainly the elephant in the room, and might be talking about cultural assimilation and issues that students are feeling, and it might be from a place where they have to kind of break down and analyze an image and then understand how to speak to that. So this is a project. It had a lot of titles, but I'm going to read a little story from this one called In Between the Fireflies. And it's based on, go back there, it's based on working with a group of elders. And I worked with them for 3 years. That was fantastic. And I think my story will tell you most of it. Now I can relax my eyes. I'm working with 14 Chinese women between the ages of 70 and 90. Oh, and a puppeteer, an unexpected collaboration. The puppeteer skids into the working space every week, flushed. Chopsticks are piercing the wild mound of graying hair. Striped socks have found their way with help of scissors to her wrist. Appliqued and layered clothes add to the sense that we are in the presence of a wild urban gypsy. She shows us puppets with used coffee filters as kerchiefs. They are delicate and unusual, almost like fossils of another culture. We speak the words English from us and Cantonese from them, and these words carve intricate paths in space like tiny fireflies, flickering and fluttering yet not caught. The language lives between these creatures. It's invisible. We are creating lists of words and movements inspired from weather, not yet knowing that wind, water, fire, and earth tell us about their well-being. Not yet knowing that one considers herself with not enough fire and the other too much wind. When rest is needed, a few scribe the words and movement through rich dark inks and bamboo brushes onto brilliant orange banners, while the others gather around generous with their advice. Our dances are accompanied by these proud flags that flutter in the disrupted air around our moving bodies. We are wondrous warriors marching through language and into our bodies and allowing the heat to whisper old secrets. This was my story, seen through my lens until a week ago. The community center coordinator arrives to make an announcement, fast words in Cantonese, cracking our code. Misunderstandings hover in the room. A cavern appears. We have a performance coming up. We will present our embodied weather. Our tiny puppets, barely named, will also perform to a group of seniors across town. Arrival times, taxi numbers, and directions are pushed into our space. I suggest she write down the information, recognizing the overwhelmed looks inscribed on the faces in the room. That wouldn't help, whispered the puppeteer. Most of them cannot read or write. Breath shortened. Eyes filled. Hands moved instinctively to the stomach. My story shifted radically in that second. The fireflies turned out their lights. The ink dried. The flags went limp. And then I caught the twinkle in Wu Yu Hawk's eyes across the room. And my story reconstructed like an explosion played backwards. I recognized the language that filled the spaces between the words and was grateful for what was spoken silently. So that's Wu Yu Hawk. And I didn't understand until that moment that most of these women were illiterate in their own language. But I also learned something very important about language, and it was interesting that the workshop itself was kind of hinged on those who could read and write as memory prompters in the performance. So this is the kind of integration I'm learning about in my practice. I come every week, I work with these wonderful women. Most of the time we dance in the chairs. They can't remember from one week to the next, so we start all over again. Something has to change, or we do something new every week. So we decided to start doing the same dance, the weather dance, and then we realized that there was a lot of elements in their tradition that related to the weather. So without even knowing, there was something intrinsically linked in their relationship to the movement. Then we said, well, let's make big cue cards on silk where you draw wind, rain, snow, and so then when we do the wind and the rain and the snow, we'll remember what comes next, because they have these huge cue cards. And the cue cards hung, and they moved like this as we moved because of the wind and the lightness of them. So suddenly, everything that was necessary in our work together ended up being intrinsically artful and empowering. So it was a huge and beautiful lesson for me. And this is another story of a blind man, which I won't read, but the story goes that we're both in a party and in the kitchen, and I'm looking around the room to see who I should talk to and who I shouldn't talk to for the night. You know, when you first arrive at a party, you're kind of like, I don't go to parties anymore, but I remember that. And he was doing the same thing, but he was doing it with his fingers, going over all the objects on the counter. And then I realized how important objects were in terms of identifying time, place, demographic, culture, all the things that he needed to know to figure out who he would talk to was in that, his hands traversing over all these objects on the counter. And that was also very important for me to understand how to work with both seeing impaired, but not with anyone in terms of the power of objects. So we're coming to Natasha and myself. So I worked on a duet with a wheelchair user, Grant, who was a figure skater, and another professional dancer. And the piece was called Not by Accident. And here's just a small piece that I wrote around that. When creating a dance duet with a wheelchair user and a professional dancer, the first question I asked Grant, the wheelchair user, was, do you consider your chair to be an external mechanism or an extension of your body? Grant's answer was that the chair was an extension of his body, which had critical impact on my choreographic decisions. My creative choices were based not only on the physical properties of the body, but also the chair. We considered leverage, fulcrum, momentum, and counterbalance of the rubber and steel, as well as the flesh and bones. They worked with their chair opposed to, against, or in addition to the chair. We were also interested in working with the difference in a way that highlight the differences in any relationship, and hoped that slowly the idea of able body and disabled body would disappear, and we would then be watching the complexities of a relationship. This is why we thought to title it Not by Accident. All too often we look at wheelchair users as the result of an accident, a deficiency due to an event, and we become obsessed with knowing what happened, opposed to what is happening in the immediate tense. The piece also troubles the notion of able-bodied opposed to the disabled body and how we create value systems based on visible differences and forget about the invisible ones. So that's what happened, and I don't have time to show you the duet, but what happened with feedback on that duet was that everybody said they saw a relationship. And they didn't see the difference in abilities. They saw a relationship in a complicated relationship. All too often, and Natasha knows this because you probably looked at these with Kathleen Irwin at some point, we go through videos on YouTube of duets between able-bodied professional dancers and wheelchair users, and there's all kinds of like physical stunts that dancers will do on the back of the chairs, on the side of the chairs, and we all look and say, oh, isn't that amazing that that dancer can do that on that chair? And we forget to look at the both of the dancers. And so in working with in working with all the productions that I've done with Natasha, I've really resisted that. Like I've been very careful to watch how the chair is moving in the space with Natasha, how Natasha is moving in the space with the chair, and how do we work within that kind of partnership to make a trilogy. And so a huge part of why our students are afraid of moving into a classroom with mixed abilities is the languaging. And I am not exempt from that. Like as I talk to you now, I'm looking at Natasha, hoping, God, did I say wheelchair user too many times? Am I blah, blah, and at the same time, I have to have the courage to put my words out into space so that Natasha and I can have a conversation. And she can say, no, don't use that word, use this word. Or, yeah, don't touch me there, touch me here. Or, no, my biceps are not as strong as my triceps, try it this way. And so this is very important that we first and foremost have the courage to enter into a dialogue where there's deep listening. And wouldn't you agree, Natasha, that a lot of times people are walking on eggshells, afraid? Yeah, so there you go. Yeah. Yeah, it is. And we have it as dancers in any situation. If I'm going to partner with Elaine, then and we're going to try, which we'll do in a second with this, and I'm going to say, am I pushing too hard, or am I gripping you too tight, or is it better if I hold you under the arm this way? Why is it that we can language that and feel pretty comfortable, but it's harder with those who have different abilities, right? So that's a huge part. Yes? Right.
So there's a distance between the social hope and what's happening in that space.
When you say focus on the bodies, are you talking about a body with a certain skill base, or?
Performative through body.
Yeah.
It's a focus on body.
Yeah.
So then I would be at that point where, well, what do I do? What do I say? I think it would be a learning process.
It would be a learning process, yeah. And also just to, it's the body and. That's how I sort of, that exercise, that tiresome exercise in theater. Yes, and, right? It's the body and. And I always feel that if there is one sense that, as I have written in my thesis, if there's one sense that has departed from a body, then I have so much to learn in how that person works with that absence, in replenishing and augmenting in other ways. And so I have a lot to learn from working with Natasha, and I'm looking forward to more of it. So this is a class that I've taught. You probably recognize some of those students. So, Kanice has 20-something wheelchairs, and you can go and get them. And sometimes I go and get them and teach a whole class with my students in a wheelchair. We may not be running around making choreography with wheelchairs. They might just sit in the wheelchair, and I'll teach the class. So it's another kind of presence, another state of mind, another kind of quiet understanding instead of sensationalizing the difference. So I'm going to work a little bit with Natasha now, and this is a little forerunner of a story. Recently, I had the honor of teaching in a mixed abilities school for dance in London. This was quite a while ago, actually. I was performing with Jade, who has severe cerebral palsy. We stood facing each other, palms of our hands pressing into each other, bearing each other's weight, a kinesthetically codependent relationship. With a professional able-bodied dancer, it would be an exercise achieved quickly and then ready for layering of content or other physical complexities. With Jade, this was enough. I was constantly renegotiating our relationship of fulcrum and balance as the tremors in her body sent layers of information through mine. It was her body's song, and I was learning the words. This is what I consider true dance. So Natasha and I are going to show something, but we can actually show something first because you've been part. Can you remind me your name?
Samita.
Samita has been part of the Bad Blood rehearsals. Are you still going to them? Not so much. Sometimes. So she knows this exercise a little bit. So if you come up, I'm going to show you how I would be working with. Connor was here last time doing it with me, so it's okay. I'll just talk you through it. We're going to face each other. Our feet are going to face each other, and just take your arms to the side, and then we're just going to put our hands up like the mirror exercise, and then you're just going to push into my hands. Good. And then we're going to take a little step back, nice hands, and we're going to press a little more. So now what we're doing is finding the fulcrum, right? And then we're going to go a little bit farther. Good. And now we're in a codependent relationship, right? Okay, so if I let go, which I'm not going to do, you would fall, and if you let go, I would fall. Okay, so this is a very powerful place because we don't know each other, and suddenly we're saving each other, aren't we? So that's really great. And we can do this with pulling as well, and we're going to show that in a second. But so what we would start to do, we would start to maybe bend our knees a little bit and see she's working really well with me. We can make it a little bit more asymmetrical. And eventually what we could do is I'm just going to step in for a sec, we could just take one hand and start to do that so that we would then open up the rest of our body. So this is how we start. Now we'll do the pull. Come back. Could start in the room to talk about friendship or dependency or complexities of relationships. And what does push pull mean to you in your relationship? So that we might do a warm-up, write about that, do some of these exercises, write a bit more, start to create scenes where we do some of this together. And finally we have a movement piece that's integrated concept and then through narrative. So now you can just put your hand there on my wrist and there. I'm just going to get your skin so I don't slip on your coat. It's okay. Okay. And we'll just step a little bit towards each other and pull away. She knows already what to do, right? She's already on it. Good. So we've found our center point really easily. With different heights and weights, sometimes it takes a bit to do that with students, and I love that listening. Then we can bend our knees, and I'm going to let go with this hand. And you see we can start to play with that and move around, right? Good job. Da, da, da. And now we could start to, if I give her this indication, she knows that I'm going to start to push. We could start going back and forth between pushing and pulling silently and feeling what the weight dependency will start to do. So that's great. Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to work back here with Natasha. Oh, look, the camera's following us. So cool. Okay, so I'll show you two different examples with Natasha. One is the push-pull example, and the other is a certain exercise that we did called light touch and travel. And so the very first thing...
Are you guys okay if I take this?
I'm okay, you okay? Yep. How do we look? Do we look good? Yeah. So the first thing that I am not interested in doing in the push-pull exercise is doing it on the mechanics of the chair. Right? If I'm going to use the chair and Natasha, they need to somehow be integrated. So we're going to try to find that out a little bit. And so the first thing I would say is if you're going to work with me, what would you rather start with, push or pull? Pull, okay. Yeah, because I think that's how we started before, right? We learned it that way. So now I need to know what side of her body she feels the most comfortable in, because it might be asymmetrical. Am I right? You might be stronger on one side than the other? Yeah. So which side are you stronger on? The left, okay. So that's the first questioning, right? And it's not easy to do that. Like, so you're stronger on that side. Do you have and biceps, or are you better with your biceps? Biceps. That work in some way, this muscle group is the one that is going to help me the most, opposed to this one here. So it helps to know we would call a ledge here. I'm going to start to apply some of my strength.
Unsure
and so
what
Natasha,
we're doing.
So you're going to take the lead and I'm going to pull away. Good, excellent. So does that help when you shift your torso over? Yeah, good. And would it help if we leveraged it against the, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so so now the chair is second in this. The arm and the muscle group that is the most important in terms of identifying strength is first. Then what she figures out, which she started to figure out with the shifting of the torso, fantastic. I have to listen to that and notice that. And then leveraging against the chair. So if your elbow goes against the chair as a pull, yeah, that helps. Okay. Now I can go even farther, right? My foot could go against that wheel, which would help me to get a little bit of leverage so I could go there. Okay, so good. Excellent. No worries. So the chair is second, and Natasha and her sense of safety is first. Is there anything that we could have done to make it even more of a counterbalance?
Not particularly. I think it's all trial and error. So.
Yeah, yeah. And how about in movement? Like we just chose a static place, but when we were going together, we found a place to move it. Would there be a possibility of shifting it?
I'm not sure.
We try it. Okay, so your elbow is down there, so it gets in the chair. I get in there, get my hand here, good. And I'm going to actually move towards the front of the room and see what happens. Nice.
And more weight.
Yeah, good. And does it matter which way you're looking at?
Like which direction?
Yeah. In terms of being able to hold my weight.
It kind of helps to
If you're moving away?
veer the away, yeah.
Okay. Then we can start to layer expression in that. Whether she looks at me when I'm doing this or whether she looks away would have a big play in the story. If she's looking away and I'm looking towards, there's a different kind of status that starts to come into it. If I'm looking away and she's looking away, there's another kind of story. So as we keep asking questions, we can start to layer it to figure out, I wrote a story about when you left that boyfriend. Let's layer that in there. Or when you left home for the first time. So in that way, we could start to figure out narratives that could come into play that were essential through the complexity of how. Okay, so now we'll do the push. How are we going to do the push? Which side would you like me to do? Same side?
Yeah.
Is it better, like it doesn't have to be arm, it could be here, or it could be in the chest.
Right.
If I get into the chest, does that put the chair in any kind of danger? No, because it's really heavy,
Yeah,
isn't it?
Yeah,
Okay, so let's try that. So I'm just going to light touch here
sure.
and see what happens. Is that comfortable?
Yeah.
Okay. Now I'm going to put one hand on the chair your brakes on.
Yes.
Good. And I'm going to start to move away. Good. I'm going to see how, I feel like I need to go a little bit lower. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So I can take off a leg. I'm going to see if I can take off this arm and what will happen. Now I have to keep this leg here, unless I did something where I used your leg a bit. Does that feel comfortable?
Yeah.
So if it moves over to that leg, what happens? Nothing?
That's fine.
There. Good. I wouldn't be able to hold that for a long time, but that was kind of interesting, wasn't it? We haven't done that before.
Right.
How did it feel for you?
Fine. It was more being a full of support.
Yeah.
Very good.
So if this leg pushed this leg, it would move over here,
Mm-hmm.
and then would it, there wouldn't be any danger here with this
No.
mechanism. Okay, so you're witnessing the questions, right? So excellent, thank you. So the next one is, so if you put your hand on top of mine, the other hand, good. And then if you just follow where I'm going to go and keep. Good. This is a way of just necessitating us listening through the body. I could even have her close her eyes, and we would do partner work in terms of locomotion. So one of the dancers in Bad Blood said, well, stand up on top of the wheelchair here, and she can move around. No. No, you can't. So I was not in the locomotion part of the chair, but being part of a deep listening between Natasha and myself. So what could happen between us, which we won't do, is that we could change leadership. I could be the one leading, she could be the one leading, and we'd try to listen back and forth. So for Natasha, we figured out that I would put my hands on her shoulder, and I would push with my palm, pull with my finger, or tilt. And that way she would understand which way I was guiding her to go. So I'll lead. Good. So basically we're not talking, we're listening. She's feeling the impulses on my hand, and then I will follow her. And now we can go back and forth where good. Thank you. Thank you very much. So what happens then in that situation with myself is that I boil down the principles of what I'm doing, and then we build it back up again. So we did it with the hand on the hand. We did it with pushing in symmetrically. But the first one, the principle was codependency. The second one was deep listening to impulse. How do we transfer that principle to the trilogy here and make it work with the same authenticity? So that's where I've got to, and that's what I've learned so far. Tasha. And I'm going to stop here and just, because I think I'm almost out of time, if you have any questions.